A single sheet of paper, sealed with the Norbrook crest, lands on the breakfast table at Whitecroft on a Tuesday morning in the deep of a wet March. The courier has ridden through rain. The wax is cold and faintly softened at its edge, and the black seal bears the impression of a rampant stag, the Norbrook device, recognised throughout 3 counties as the mark of a house that does not send letters without deliberate intention. Vivian Netmont picks it up with hands still gritty from banking the kitchen fire. She turns it once, reads the direction on the front, and sets it beside her cup. She finishes her porridge. Then she looks at the seal again, and this time the look is the one she uses when she is reading the western sky for weather. Level, unhurried, taking in the full thing before deciding what it means. This is worth understanding from the beginning. Vivian is 26, unmarried, and has been the sole manager of Whitecroft for 3 years, since her father, Thomas Netmont, died of the fever in the autumn of his 52nd year, in the same upstairs room where he had been born. Her brother James, who might have stood beside her in this work, is listed in the Admiralty rolls as missing at sea since the previous November, a category the family has not yet graduated to calling a death, though the months are accumulating and the patience required to keep the word missing in its place is beginning to wear thin. The estate is mortgaged in 3 places. The farm called Closes, which runs along the northern boundary and carries 3 tenant families with it, will be surrendered to the creditors by midsummer if nothing changes. Vivian knows these numbers, not as figures on a page, but as the faces of people she has sat with at kitchen tables. The Briggs family at Closes, whose grandfather planted the hedgerow that marks the eastern edge. Old Mrs. Pember in the tied cottage below the orchard, who was present on the day Vivian's mother arrived at Whitecroft as a young bride, and who has nowhere else to be. She carries all of it, and the carrying is visible, not in her expression, which is composed, but in the way she moves through the house and the land, measuring each step as though she is already in negotiation with the ground beneath her feet. She had been out before breakfast. The path from the back of the house runs down through the water meadow to the boundary stone, where 2 letters face each other in the worn limestone. An N and a P, cut nearly 60 years ago for reasons that neither estate can now agree upon. The Netmonts say the stone marks the true extent of their land. The Norbrook solicitors, and before them their father's solicitors, and before them the generation before that, say the opposite. And the suit over the lower meadow has been grinding through Chancery for the better part of 2 decades, slowly converting the grief of an old quarrel into legal procedure, which is one of the more reliable ways that grief finds to keep itself alive. On this particular morning, the meadow is standing in an inch of brown water. The osiers at the field's edge are just beginning to redden, the first colour in a landscape that has been nothing but grey and mud-brown since October. And a pair of lapwings work the soggy ground near the stream, unhurried, making the small piping sound they make when no one is disturbing them. Vivian stops at the boundary stone, as she does every morning she walks this way, and rests her fingers on the N. The limestone is cold and granular. Beneath her coat, on a thin ribbon worn close against her skin, hangs her father's seal ring, a flat oval of cornelian in a plain silver setting, the Netmont device engraved so faint now that it is more impression than image, the years having softened it, the way years soften everything they cannot quite erase. She has worn it since the morning after he died. She is not, as a rule, given to ceremony, but this she has kept. Back inside, the kitchen is warm and close, smelling of wood smoke and the salt pork that has been the centrepiece of most meals since January. Martha, who has been nurse and housekeeper and general conscience of Whitecroft since before Vivian was born, is standing at the range with an expression she wears when the larder is worrying her, which lately amounts to most mornings. Martha is a compact, grey-haired woman in her 60s, short and certain, with the particular authority that accumulates not from rank, but from having been necessary for 40 years in the same house to the same family. She does not look up from the pot. She says, "The flour's down to the last sack. Briggs hasn't sent the account." "I know," says Vivian. "I'll ride to closes this afternoon." "You rode there Thursday." "And I'll ride there today." Martha sets her spoon on the hook and turns. And what passes between them in the 3 seconds of eye contact is not put into words, because it does not need to be. There is a second face in the kitchen, younger, quieter, watching. Polly, the new scullery maid, came to Whitecroft 6 weeks ago from the Harrington tenant family at the eastern edge of the estate, where a fourth daughter had proved one mouth more than the household could quietly sustain. She is perhaps 15, with red and capable hands and eyes that miss nothing. And she has developed the habit of going absolutely still whenever the mistress enters a room. Not in fear, exactly, but in the manner of someone who has understood that this is a person from whom things can be learned, and who is determined not to miss any of it. She is doing it now, standing at the scullery board with a cloth in her hands and her whole attention fixed on Vivian, with an unguarded intensity that Martha has noticed, catalogued, and privately approved. Mr. Farrar arrives mid-morning, as he does every few weeks, thin, punctual, carrying the smell of an office and the manner of a man who has long since made his peace with delivering news in careful portions, never all at once. He is the Netmont man of business, inherited along with the ledgers and the correspondence when Vivian's father died, and his relationship to any complete account of a situation tends toward the selective. He takes his usual chair across from Vivian in the small room off the hall that serves as her office, her father's study, still carrying his books along the shelves, a smell of old paper and pipe tobacco in the curtains that she has never moved to change. On the wall hangs the estate map, hand-drawn on linen, its margins filled with her father's cramped annotations in 2 different inks, each representing a different year of optimism. On the corner of the desk sits the account ledger that Vivian has been maintaining since she took over. The same dark green binding as the one before it, though the figures inside are considerably less comfortable. Farrar opens his case. He says, in the careful, rhythmic way he has, that the Chancery suit is proceeding toward a favourable outcome. He uses the phrase "near victory" twice in the same breath, which is once too many for a man of his precision. His hands are steady on the papers he draws out. It is his eyes that are not. Vivian has sat across from him in this room for 3 years. She watches the small flicker, no more than a shadow crossing still water, a fraction of a second's hesitation that the word victory produces, before he smooths it over. And she does not remark on it. She says the appropriate things, she asks the appropriate questions. When he is gone, she sits for a moment with her hands flat on the green ledger and considers what portion of the picture he has left out, and whether it is large or small, and what it will cost her when it appears. She does not have long to form her conclusions. The second letter arrives that afternoon by a different courier, a young man on a bay horse wearing Norbrook livery, a dark blue coat with silver buttons, the stag worked into the clasp of his cloak. Everything about him communicating that this particular household has never suffered a budget crisis and does not intend to start. The letter is addressed in a formal hand to Mrs. Vivian Netmont, and beneath the address, in smaller lettering, "Private, at the request of the Duke of Norbrook." She takes it to the study. She lights the single candle on the desk, the tallow one in the brass holder that has sat in the same spot for as long as she can remember. Its brass worn pale at the grip, though the afternoon light through the narrow window would be adequate. The candle is a matter of discipline rather than necessity. She lights it when she means to read a thing closely, and she has learned to honour that ritual. She breaks the seal with her penknife, unfolds the page, and reads it through once. She sets it on the desk. She looks at the flame. She reads it again. The letter bears the name of Greaves, the Duke's solicitor, but its tone does not read like a solicitor's voice working alone. There is a precision in it that is not merely legal, a care in the address of the situation that extends beyond the technical points of the dispute to the circumstances of both estates, Vivian's included, and the weight of this is considerable, because no Norbrook document in 3 years of correspondence has acknowledged Whitecroft's position as anything other than an obstacle. This one does. It names Vivian directly as the proposed party to a marriage settlement. It lists the terms, the mortgage on closes addressed to a specific figure, the terms of the boundary agreement laid out in plain language, the timelines precise. It asks for her answer within 30 days. And in the final paragraph, in a sentence she reads 3 times without entirely believing it, it states that the Duke of Norbrook intends, should she find herself willing, to settle the matter as 2 families settling their books, rather than 2 adversaries drawing their lines. Outside the window, rain resumes. It comes in at an angle, running down the old glass in crooked channels. The candle flame bends in the draught from the ill-fitting frame, throws a long shadow across the estate map, and for a moment, the lower meadow, the disputed meadow, the N and the P on the limestone, the osiers beginning to redden, is swallowed in that shadow, as though claimed. Vivian thinks about the Briggs family at closes, and the shape of the summer without them. She thinks about old Mrs. Pember in the Tide cottage. She thinks about her brother James, who would have stood in this room with her, and who is not here. She touches, once, the outline of her father's seal ring through the cloth of her coat. She draws the good paper from the drawer, the laid stock, cream and slightly rough, that her father kept for formal correspondence, and uncaps her ink. She does not write yes. She writes that she considers the proposal one that merits a meeting, that she will receive the full terms, and that she expects those terms to be communicated with the same specificity as the initial offer. She sands the sheet, folds it, seals it with the cornelian ring. The impression is faint, the device barely legible, but it is there. She calls for the courier before he can have cleared the lane. It is not a surrender. She is clear on this point, alone in the study with the rain on the glass and the map on the wall. It is an economic calculation, the same discipline she applies to the weather, to the account ledger, to the measurement of steps across a flooded field. She does not know the Duke of Norbrook. She knows of him, 34, inherited the title young, runs the estates with a cold efficiency the county respects without particularly warming to, has never married, a subject on which the gossip is plentiful and almost certainly worthless. She knows that in the 16 years of the dispute she has been alive to witness, he has never once appeared at Chancery himself. Always his solicitors, always his agents, never the man. What she cannot account for, what sits at the edge of the evening as the candle burns lower, is why a man whose suit is running in his favour by any reasonable measure would choose this moment to offer terms. And why, when those terms arrived, they read not as a conqueror's dictation, but as something else. Considered, almost careful, like a letter written by someone who has thought about it for a long time, and is not entirely certain he is doing the right thing. Whether the Duke is a man to be trusted, or whether the careful respect of his letter is simply the more sophisticated form of the same pressure that has been grinding at Whitecroft for 20 years, that is the question that follows her out of the study, through supper, and into the long dark hours while the rain settles into its steady determination, and the last candle on the desk burns down to its brass collar and goes out. The reply she sent was answered within 4 days. Not by Greaves, the solicitor, but in a brief note in a different hand, smaller, more controlled, with no flourishes at the capitals, the kind of handwriting produced by someone who learned to write not for display, but for precision. The Duke of Norbrook confirmed that a meeting might be arranged at the offices of his solicitor in the market town of Aldwych on the following Thursday at 10 in the morning, if that proved convenient. He signed it, Richard Norn, Duke of Norbrook, the full formal title, which might have read as assertion, except that it came after his given name, and the given name came first, and that sequence was not an accident. She rode to Aldwych with Martha, who insisted on accompanying her, and who sat through the carriage journey in the particular charged silence that was her method of communicating disapproval without opening the subject to debate. Martha had views about the Duke of Norbrook. She had carried those views for the better part of 30 years, inheriting them along with her position, and while she was too loyal and too sensible to speak them aloud in a way that might undermine Vivian's decision, she conveyed them through the set of her back and the angle of her bonnet brim with considerable efficiency. The solicitor's rooms were on the upper floor of a building that smelled of old paper and coal. Mr. Greaves met her at the door, a careful, dry, perfectly correct man in his 50s, the kind who had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a solicitor can offer his clients is the complete absence of personal opinion. He showed her into the inner room. The Duke of Norbrook was already there. She had formed no picture of him. This was a deliberate choice. She had refused to ask anyone who might have told her, because arriving with a preconception seemed a disadvantage she could not afford. So the man she saw when she entered the room was simply what he was, which is to say, not what she would have constructed from the components of his reputation. He was tall, and the height was evident even seated, the way height always announces itself before a person stands. Dark coat, charcoal rather than black, of very fine wool, but cut without any fashionable affectation, no padding at the shoulders, no exaggerated collar points. He stood when she came in, and the movement was unhurried, the kind of stillness a man either learns or is born with, and in this case, it was impossible to tell which. His hair was dark, his features composed into an expression that communicated attention without offering anything further. His hands, she noticed, were large and well kept, and he held them at rest with the same precision as the rest of him. No rings, no watch chain visible. He was 34, and he looked it, without either apology or effort. He said good morning. She said good morning. Mr. Greaves invited them both to sit, and they sat, and the next 2 hours were given over entirely to the documents on the table between them, which was precisely what the meeting was for. He was careful with her, not gentle in the drawing-room sense. There was nothing soft in the way he spoke, or in the questions he put to Greaves, or in the way he tracked the numbers on the page. But when he addressed her directly, it was without condescension, which in that period, in a meeting of that nature, between a duke and a woman managing her own estate, was the kind of care that required specific intention. At one point, she put a question about the survey figures for the lower field, and he waited until she had finished the question before he answered it. And his answer was direct and complete, and did not simplify for her benefit. She noticed all of this. She noted it the same way she had noted Mr. Fra's flicker 6 weeks before, catalogued, filed, not yet interpreted. The terms were what the letter had promised. The mortgage on closes would be discharged against a separate accounting, the lower meadow settled, the chancery suit withdrawn, on both sides. He asked her, once, whether she had any further conditions. She said she did not, which was true. He nodded once and turned back to the papers. When it was done, he held the door for her on the landing. She thanked him. He said, formally and without any warmer register, that he hoped Whitecroft would find the arrangement satisfactory. She said she believed it would. He said he would see her at the church. And that was the sum of what passed between them before the wedding. 6 weeks is not very long to prepare for a marriage, when the marriage is also a negotiation, an economic rescue, and the closing of a wound that has been open since before you were born. But Whitecroft had never kept the kind of establishment that required a long preparation, and Vivian was not a woman who believed in theatricality for its own sake. The wedding would be at the grey stone church that stood almost exactly between the two estates, in a village called Hinton, that had been serving the needs of both properties for 300 years. Baptisms, burials, the occasional marriage, with the steady impartiality of a place that belongs to no one and outlasts everyone. The veil was Martha's contribution. She produced it one morning from the cedar chest in the attic, without preamble or explanation. And when Vivian shook it open, it proved to be a length of very fine Brussels lace. Ivory rather than white, the colour that old lace achieves when it has been stored correctly for a generation. It had belonged to Mrs. Tanner, the wife of the previous vicar of Hinton, who had died without daughters, and who had left, among her few personal effects, a note specifying that the veil should go to whatever young woman of the parish next had need of it, and no money for one of her own. Martha had held it in keeping for 7 years. She set it on the table in front of Vivian without comment. The gesture itself was the comment. Vivian wore her best day dress, altered at the bodice. It was grey-blue, the colour of winter water, wool rather than silk, with no ornamentation at the cuffs and nothing at the neck but a small paste brooch that had been her mother's. She was not, and had never been, the kind of woman who received compliments on her appearance as though they were an answer to something. She stood before the small glass in her room on the wedding morning, turned left, turned right, and decided she would do. The county had come. This was the part she had not entirely prepared herself for. Hinton Church held perhaps 60 people in comfort, and perhaps 90 in the kind of companionable difficulty that a rural county regards as festive. And on that morning, it held closer to 90. Because whatever the Duke of Norbrook did attracted attention, and whatever the last Netmont daughter did had been attracting the wrong kind of attention for 3 years. And the combination of the two was the sort of event that people in the surrounding parishes would be discussing for a decade. The pews were full when Vivian arrived. She came in on the arm of Mr. Fra, that there was no other man available, a fact she had noted and absorbed without dwelling on it, and she walked down the aisle of Hinton Church with her face unreadable, and the borrowed Brussels lace over her hair and the cornelian ring in its usual place against her breastbone. She recognised faces as she passed. The Halsworth family from the Eastern Valley, the Pembers' eldest son, 2 women from the sewing circle her mother had once organised, and which had continued without either the organisation or her mother. And on the Norbrook side, 2 people whose presence she registered immediately and separately. Lady Bellingham occupied the 3rd pew on the left, a woman of perhaps 45, dressed in a precise dove grey that stopped just short of being mourning, with an arrangement of feathers in her hat that required more confidence than grief. She was a widow of independent means, and, as 3 years of county gossip had established beyond reasonable doubt, had arranged a considerable portion of her social calendar around the Duke of Norbrook's proximity for the better part of 2 years. She watched Vivian walk past with an expression of composed, crystalline assessment that contains nothing so crude as jealousy and nothing so honest as indifference. Sir Gerald Norne occupied the 2nd pew from the front on the right. He was the Duke's cousin by way of an uncle who had not inherited, and he had therefore spent his entire adult life in proximity to a title and an estate that were not his, which had produced in him the particular quality of grievance that such proximity reliably manufactures. He was large, florid, and impeccably dressed, in a manner that communicated expense rather than taste. As Vivian passed his pew, he did not adjust his expression. He looked at the veil, and then at the dress, and then at nothing in particular, and his mouth settled into a shape that was not quite a smile. Richard Norn was at the altar. He turned when she reached the front, and his face wore the same composition she had seen at Greaves's office, attentive, contained, giving nothing additional away. He did not look at the veil or the dress. He looked at her face. The ceremony was brief, which was what she had requested, and which he had not objected to. The vicar of Hinton, Mr. Ashworth, a young man with a mild manner and a thorough command of the prayer book, read the service with quiet efficiency. The ring, when Richard placed it on her finger, was gold, with a small inset of dark blue enamel, and it was warm, not cold, which surprised her. She had expected the cold of something kept in a coat pocket, but he had been holding it in his closed hand throughout the service, and the warmth of it was so unexpected that she looked up at him for a half-second before she could stop herself. He was looking at the ring. His expression did not change. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenley, which Vivian entered for the first time as its mistress. The great house stood at the end of a beech avenue, every tree still winter bare, their dark branches making a long, formal corridor of the approach. Inside, the reception rooms had been opened and fires laid in all of them, and the effect was not warm so much as correctly arranged, the house performing hospitality with the precision of long practice rather than current feeling. The silver was excellent, the food was excellent, the flowers, hothouse narcissus, paper white, 30 or 40 stems in tall crystal vases along the tables, were the first living colour she had seen in those rooms, and they stood in the candlelight with a brightness that seemed almost unnecessary against the oak panels and dark hangings. The guests arranged themselves in the way of such gatherings, in clusters of established allegiance, with gaps between them where allegiance was unclear or contested. Vivian moved through the room beside her husband, received the congratulations of people she did not know, and said the correct things with the steady composure she had been practicing since she was 9 years old and her mother had sat her down before a difficult meeting and told her, "Your face is your most useful property. Manage it accordingly." Sir Gerald had been drinking before the toasts began. This was evident not in any obvious way. He held himself upright, spoke without slurring, gave no outward sign of excess, but in the volume, which had been climbing steadily since the opening of the champagne, and in the increasing frequency with which his voice cut across the adjacent conversations. He was holding court near the end of the second table, with 3 other men who were laughing at the right intervals, when Vivian passed close enough to hear him clearly. He said, "The meadow is near worth the encumbrance of the wife." He did not lower his voice. He may, in fact, have raised it slightly. The cluster of guests nearest to him went quiet, in the particular way of people who have heard something that requires a decision, whether to acknowledge it, whether to laugh, whether to look elsewhere and allow the moment to dissolve. One of the 3 men laughed, uncertainly, and then stopped because the room had done the thing that rooms sometimes do, a rapid, spreading stillness that moves through a gathering faster than sound. Vivian was 3 feet away. She heard it. She did not turn. She kept her face at the angle it had been, and her expression did not change. And in the 2 seconds that followed, she became very precisely aware of every person in her immediate vicinity, which people were watching her for a reaction, and how many of them expected her to have none. Richard had been speaking with Mr. Ashworth when it happened. He was not 3 feet away. He was closer to 12. But the stillness reached him the same way it reached everyone else, and he turned into it. He would have had to look for the source. He found it quickly, because Sir Gerald had resumed speaking at the same volume, now apparently to himself, and this made the source easy to locate. What followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Richard crossed the room. He did not rush, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not touch his cousin. He stopped at a distance that was correct for a private word but insufficient for privacy, and he said something in a tone that did not carry beyond the immediate circle. Sir Gerald's expression moved through several stages. First, the reflexive assurance of a man who has been excused his whole life. Then something that recalibrated. Then a colour in his face that was not pleasure. He set down his glass. He said something that incorporated the word cousin in a justifying register. Richard said something else, and this time 2 words of it reached Vivian, who was still standing 3 feet away with her face arranged. My Duchess. After that, Sir Gerald performed the calculation that the room was performing on his behalf, and the calculation came out the same way, and he put down his plate, made a general bow to no one in particular, and left. The room began, cautiously, to resume itself. Richard came to stand beside her. He picked up a glass from the tray that a footman was hovering with nearby, offered it to her, and when she took it, he took one himself, and turned to face the room with her. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not offer comfort or explanation or any register of the preceding 90 seconds. He stood there, and the standing was the thing, the visible placement of himself beside her, in front of every person in that room, the declaration made by proximity rather than by further words. He did, once, turn his head fractionally in her direction. He said, quietly, "You were not meant to hear that." She said, "I did hear it." He nodded once. That was all. Later, the guests gone, the fires banked, the great house settling into its nighttime sounds, she was crossing the upper corridor to her rooms when she heard him behind her. The corridor was lit by 2 wall sconces, their light thin and yellowish, and the boards underfoot were old and expressed their opinions of foot traffic in a low, continuous commentary of creaks. He had come out of the library at the far end and was walking in her direction, and he stopped when he drew level with her, which meant she stopped too, because the corridor was not quite wide enough to pretend not to. He said, "I want to be plain with you." She waited. "You are my wife, and my name is on you. No one insults it in my hearing." There was nothing in his face that indicated he expected thanks. There was nothing that indicated he wanted acknowledgement or reciprocation. He had stated a fact in the manner of a man who believes in making the terms of a thing explicit, because explicit terms prevent misunderstanding, and misunderstanding is a waste of everyone's time. He inclined his head, which was the courtesy he had been applying all day, even and formal and unvarying, and he walked past her toward his rooms. She stood in the corridor a little while after he had gone. The sconce nearest her threw a long shadow along the wainscoting. In the room beyond the wall, she could hear a maid moving. The distant, muffled sounds of the end of a long house day. Someone carrying something. The soft knock of a door. The neat architecture of her dislike, which she had been constructing and maintaining since before she knew the Duke's given name, had been built for a different kind of man. A man who would have laughed at Sir Gerald's remark, or pretended not to hear it, or heard it and weighed his cousin's usefulness before deciding whether to respond. The specific weight-bearing wall of that architecture was the assumption that he was a man who would always, at the essential moment, choose what was convenient over what was right. She had built the whole structure on that assumption, which had seemed very solid when she made it, and which had now demonstrated the particular fragility of assumptions that have never been tested. She was not sure what to do about this. She was not sure whether cold honour in a man who has been your adversary for 3 years constitutes a reason to revise anything, or whether it is simply a new form of the same adversary, presenting a different angle. She could not tell yet which of these was true. She understood, standing in the corridor with his footsteps gone quiet behind a distant door, that she would have to wait and watch and count the evidence, the way she counted every other thing, carefully, with patience, without letting the wishing for an answer produce the answer itself. The house was very quiet. Through a window at the corridor's end, the beach avenue was just visible in the dark. Those long rows of bare branches she had driven under that afternoon for the first time, now silver-grey in the light of a moon that kept appearing and disappearing behind fast-moving cloud. Ravenlay in the dark was a different proposition from Ravenlay in the candlelit performance of a wedding breakfast. It was older and larger and more self-contained, and it had been doing its own business for several centuries before tonight, and would continue doing it regardless of what tonight had meant. She did not yet know the names of the 42 people who slept under this roof. She did not know where the West Wing's roof was leaking, or what the arrangement was with the home farm, or what the account books looked like, or any of the 100 things she had needed to know at Whitecroft before she could be useful there. She had walked into a house that was not yet hers in any sense beyond the legal, and she did not know the man at the end of its corridor in any sense at all. In the morning, she would start with the names. She started with the names. Not a list, not the ledger page that Mrs. Harker, the housekeeper, had prepared for her and left on the desk in what would be her study, a careful column in a careful hand, with ranks and functions noted in a separate column like a property inventory. Vivian understood the intention behind that document, and also its limitation, which is that a list of names with functions attached is a map of a house's structure, not of its people. She folded the paper and put it in the desk drawer, and spent the first week at Ravenley learning the names the other way, face to face, in the places where the work happened. The kitchens on the first morning. The laundry yard the morning after that. The stables on Wednesday, where she spent an hour with the head groom, a phlegmatic Shropshire man named Cottle, who had the air of someone who had reserved his final opinion of all new people for the first 20 years of acquaintance and would not be hurried. The still room, the buttery, the cold larder, the estate office that smelled of old wax and leather bindings. She did not announce her intention to inspect anything. She arrived, introduced herself to whoever was present, asked a question, and listened to the answer. Some answers were complete. Some were careful. She received them all with the same attention, and she took nothing down in front of anyone, which was its own communication, that she was there to understand, not to find fault. Mrs. Harker watched this from a measured distance. She was a spare, grey-haired woman in her mid-50s, upright in the way of someone who had been responsible for the correct running of a large establishment for so long that correct posture had become indistinguishable from correct character. She had been housekeeper at Ravenlay since before Richard inherited the title, and she had an understanding of the house that went several layers deeper than any ledger. She knew which chimneys drew poorly in easterly wind, which of the upper guest rooms held damp in October, which 5 footmen could be trusted with the good wine service, and which could not. She had managed 2 dowager duchesses, a full season's worth of house guests, and 3 occasions when the main staircase carpet had been replaced, and she had never found it necessary to express an opinion about any of them to anyone who did not require it for operational purposes. She had not expected the new Duchess to ask about the west roof on the 4th day. Vivian had found it herself. She had gone up to the attic floor at the end of the east corridor, curiosity about the house's proportions, which did not quite match the external silhouette, and she had found the bucket. It was a good bucket, large, of heavy galvanized iron, set in a precise position below a dark stain on the timber, where the plaster had come away in a long triangular section. Around the bucket, the floorboards had faded to a lighter colour than the surrounding wood, from repeated wetting and repeated drying, which was the record of several years rather than several months. She asked Mrs. Harker about it at the end of the afternoon, in the housekeeper's room, which was warm and close, and smelled of the dried lavender that hung in bundles from the low beam. "How long?" she said. Mrs. Harker was silent for a moment. with the particular quality of silence that signals a calculation, not evasion, but a sorting of facts to determine which the question requires. 3 winters, Mrs. Harker said. The slates had slipped after a heavy snow, and the surveyor's estimate for the repair had gone to the Duke's agent at the time, and the agent had forwarded it, and nothing further had come back. She said this without inflection, which was itself a form of commentary. The bucket, she said, was replaced every 2 days when I trained. Vivian said she would write to the slater that week. Mrs. Harker received this with an expression that moved almost imperceptibly before it settled back to its usual composition. It was the expression of someone who has been doing a task that should not have been necessary for longer than is reasonable and has just been told they need not do it anymore. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." And the Your Grace sat in the room between them for a moment with its full weight. Not the title as form, but the title as a declaration that the woman across the small table had earned it in some practical sense that the ceremony had not yet established. The tenant dispute came to her attention at the end of the second week via the estate's land steward, a sensible man named Mr. Fenn, who had been running the Ravenley farms since the previous Duke's time, and who had the farmer's habit of stating problems in terms of their physical facts before moving toward their human component. He said there had been a disagreement between 2 tenants, Alderton at the upper pasture and Cray at the lower field, over a drainage ditch that ran between their 2 holdings. He said it had become an argument over the past summer and was now approaching the character of a genuine feud. He said he had proposed 3 different arrangements for the maintenance of the ditch, all of which had been refused by one party or the other, and that both Alderton and Cray were now maintaining separate sections of the adjoining fence in ways that were functionally passive and mutually spiteful. He laid the estate map on the desk, a different map from the one at Whitecroft, larger and more recently redrawn, but carrying its own marginal annotations in 2 or 3 different hands, and pointed to the ditch's course along the boundary of the 2 properties. He said that the legal position was not entirely clear and that he had been waiting for guidance on how to proceed. Vivian looked at the map for a moment and then said she would ride out the following morning and have a look at the ditch. Mr. Fenn's expression managed to convey in rapid succession surprise, reassessment, and something that might have been suppressed relief. He said he would accompany her. She put on her oldest boots, good stout leather, resoled twice, not riding boots but walking ones, the kind that had crossed the water meadow at Whitecroft in every season for 5 years, and the 2 of them rode out into a cold April morning, with a low sky and the smell of recently turned earth coming up from the fields in long drifts. The ditch was accessible from the lower end of Cray's field, where the hedge thinned to a gap, and from there she could see the full run of it as it descended toward the boundary. Cray met them at the gap, compact and careful in the way of men who have been right for a long time without receiving acknowledgement. He walked with them along the bank and explained the situation in the steady, procedural manner of a man who has rehearsed it, with references to Alderton's negligence and the pattern of winter flooding and the particular incompetence of the original survey. Then Vivian went into the ditch. Not the full depth, the bank was reasonable and the water was winter cold, but manageable with the stout boots, but far enough to see the lower section, which was what she had wanted to see after the first 50 yards of walking the bank. Mr. Fenn followed. Cray watched from the edge. She found what she was looking for a third of the way along, the sluice. It was an old one, built of stone and timber, clearly contemporary with the original drainage of the fields, 2 generations ago at least, possibly 3. The timber was gone, the stones slumped to one side, and the collapse had redirected a portion of the winter runoff in a way that created the flooding pattern that Cray was experiencing on his lower field. The flooding pattern that Alderton was being blamed for. Neither man had done this. Time and water had done it. Over enough years that the original sluice had ceased to be recognisable as such, and both tenants had been arguing in good faith about a cause that neither of them had created. She climbed out of the ditch. She told Cray what she had found. She sent Mr. Fenn to bring Alderton from the upper pasture. When all three were present, she stood on the bank and explained the sluice and its history, with the map for reference, and she described what the repair would require. A mason, 2 days, materials from the estate, and she said the cost would be divided between the estate and the two holdings, in a proportion she named, which was fair by any measure that favoured accuracy over convenience. Alderton and Cray looked at each other. They looked at her. They looked at the ditch. Then Alderton put out his hand and Cray shook it, which is not a thing that either man had expected to do that morning when they woke up. The story was at the inn at Hinton by Thursday. Mrs. Harker left the violets on a Monday. The vase was small, dark blue glass, perhaps 4 inches tall, the kind of thing that lives on a windowsill for years and becomes invisible through long familiarity until it is moved. Vivian found it on the corner of her desk when she came in from the West Wing survey, which she had begun compiling after the Slaters' visit confirmed the roof repair was larger than a single season's budget would accommodate and required sequencing across 2 years. The violets were deep purple, the colour of the early ones that push through soil, before anything else has the conviction to try. And they were very small, and they smelled precisely of themselves, which is the smell of early spring in cold ground. Mrs. Harker was in the corridor when Vivian came out. Vivian said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harker." The housekeeper said, with the particular precision of a person who does not waste a compliment, but means the one she gives, "The East Garden boarder yields them every year. The previous Duchess, that would be His Grace's mother, used to say they were the only reliable promise the garden kept." This was the most Mrs. Harker had said at one time, about anything that was not operational, and it landed in the corridor with the weight of a confidence extended, not casually but deliberately, to someone who had been judged worth extending it to. Vivian understood what was being offered, and she received it with the attention it merited. She said, "I'll have to learn where the East Garden border is." Mrs. Harker said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, "I will show you, Your Grace, when you have a free morning." They both understood that free mornings were not currently a feature of the calendar. The acknowledgement that one might eventually arrive was its own form of declaration. The harvest came in the first week of August, which was 3 weeks early because the summer had been hot and dry since June. And the barometer at Ravenlay dropped on a Tuesday evening, in a way that Mr. Fenn said meant storm before Sunday, and was read by the older farm men as meaning storm before Saturday, and turned out to mean storm before Friday. This gave them 3 days. 3 days to get the wheat in from 4 fields, 2 Norbrook fields, and 2 that had been Netmont fields, and were now, by virtue of the settlement, managed jointly. The labour required went beyond what either estate kept in regular employ, and Vivian had understood this on Wednesday morning when the barometer made its declaration, and had spent Wednesday evening doing arithmetic at the desk with the violets, long since dried now, kept because the vase had stayed, working out which of the tenant families had able hands, who could be paid at what rate, and how to deploy them across the fields in a sequence that started with the most exposed crop and worked inward. She was out at first light Thursday. She did not send a message to Mr. Fenn to organise it. She organised it herself. The sequence she had planned on paper proved correct in 3 of the 4 fields, and required adjustment in the 4th, where the ground was wetter than expected along the north edge, and she called the adjustment without hesitation, and the labour followed it. The 2 families from Closes, Briggs and his eldest son among them, Whitecroft tenants now working Norbrook ground under a Norbrook Duchess who had kept their farm out of the mortgagee's hands, worked through Thursday without complaint, and through Friday with the grim cheerfulness of people who have something real at stake and know it. The third day was the brutal one. The storm was coming by late afternoon. The horizon to the southwest had gone a colour that needed no interpretation, and the last of the wheat was in the far field. She set the pace herself, not by instruction, but by example, working the row end where the binding was slowest, and the pace moved through the field as paces do when the person setting it has earned the standing to set it. Richard was at the edge of the north field. He had come out in the early afternoon. She had registered his arrival in the way she registered the position of every person in a working field, peripherally, precisely, without turning toward it. He had not joined the work. He had simply come to stand at the field's edge, at the gap in the hedgerow where the track entered, with his coat open and his arms at rest, and he had watched. She did not know how long he had been there. She did not know what had brought him out, whether his agent had reported to him, or whether he had come of his own motion. She knew that the storm reached the field boundary at almost exactly the same moment as the last sheaf, and that this was sufficiently close a thing that it was satisfying in the specific way that satisfying things are when they are earned rather than given. And she knew that she was very tired, and that her shoulders ached from the binding work, and that there was mud up to the knee on her left boot. And she knew that Richard was still at the field's edge when she finally turned to look. He was watching her, not the field, her. His expression was doing the thing she had come to recognize over the past weeks, the controlled, careful composition that could mean many things or nothing. Except that this time, standing at the edge of a harvested field, with the storm beginning to come in at the corner of the sky, she had enough evidence accumulated to read it with a little more precision. It was not nothing. She knew that now, the way she knew the barometer and the west sky and the sound of the drainage ditch in winter, through patient watching over sufficient time. He inclined his head toward her across the field. The gesture was small, formal, the same courtesy he gave everyone. But it was not the same, and they both knew it, and neither said so. She turned back to the field to count who still needed the task assignment. The storm would reach them in under an hour. There was still enough to do. They travelled to London in the third week of October. Enter's beaches along the Ravenlay Avenue had gone to their full gold, and the mornings were carrying the particular cold that signals not autumn's continuation, but its ending. The journey took 2 days. They rode the first stretch in the same carriage, a large, well-sprung vehicle in the Norbrook dark blue, with the stag on the door panel, and on the second morning, somewhere past the point where the road climbed out of the vale and the landscape flattened toward the city, Vivian became aware that they had been travelling in silence for nearly an hour, without either of them finding it uncomfortable. Which was a thing that had not been true of the first silence they shared, in Greaves's office in Aldwych in April. Richard was reading. He had a sheaf of documents from his estate agent, the kind of den Augusta Norn lived in, a house on a narrow crescent south of Holborn that had been respectable 40 years ago and was now merely quiet, a distinction she appeared to regard as an improvement. Richard had explained this during the carriage ride, not as an apology, but as a preparation, in the way he had developed of providing relevant information before it was needed rather than after. His grandmother, he said, had moved to this address 3 years following the death of his father and had declined every subsequent attempt to shift her, including 2 formal proposals from the estate's trustees and 1 from Richard himself, which she had received with the same mild finality she apparently applied to all proposals that ran counter to her existing arrangements. Vivian listened and said nothing, because what she was attending to was not the address, but the information she was now carrying that Richard did not yet fully possess, and the question of how those 2 asymmetries would resolve when they reached the house. She had told him the substance of Mr. Farr's account the previous evening, in the small sitting room of the lodgings, with the fire going low and the noise of the street a thin presence beyond the curtained window. She had told it plain, that Mr. Farr claimed the original cause of the Netmont-Norbrook dispute was a jilting, that a Netmont daughter, her own namesake, an earlier Vivian, had been left at the altar by the Norbrook heir, and that the heir had then pressed the boundary claim as a further humiliation. She told it without editorial, watching Richard's face as she spoke. His face did the thing it did sometimes, the stillness that was not the stillness of composure, but of a structure encountering a fissure it had not known was there. He had sat with it, hands flat on his knees, and then he had said quietly, "I don't know this." And she had believed him, because what she heard in those 4 words was not surprise at a fact, but something older and more unsettling, the discomfort of a man discovering that the history he had been handed was incomplete in ways that had been invisible until now. They had agreed, without much further discussion, that Augusta was the only person alive who might be able to tell them what had actually happened. Richard had said she was 91 and in possession of all her faculties and extremely unlikely to be impressed by either of them. Vivian had said she sounded manageable. He had looked at her with something very close to a smile before he caught it back. The house was narrow, 3 stories, with a black-painted door and 2 small windows on the ground floor, behind which a faint warmth of candlelight was visible in the grey October morning. A manservant opened the door, old, very correct, with the composed authority of a man who had been serving the same household for longer than anyone could claim to remember, and showed them through a tiled hall into a front room that was dim and warm and almost entirely occupied by books. Not decorative books, not the leather-backed ranks that filled the libraries of houses with more money than reading. These were books that had been used, extensively and without apology, shelved in no visible order beyond some private logic of their owner, several volumes lying flat on top of the upright ones, a few open on the low table nearest the fire. The room smelled of coal smoke and paper, and something fainter, floral, that turned out to be the source of the only ornament on the mantelpiece, a small, dried posy of white flowers in a flat-bottomed glass vase. The kind of thing pressed into someone's hand at a christening or a wedding, long past fresh but preserved with the particular deliberateness that attaches to objects kept not for beauty, but for what they mean. The petals had gone to parchment, the stems were nearly black, the glass was clean. Augusta Norn was in the chair by the fire. She was very small and very old, and possessed of the quality that extreme age sometimes produces in a person who has not ceased to pay attention. A compression, as though the years had reduced everything peripheral and left only the essential parts. Her hair was white, wound close to her head. Her hands, folded over a closed book on her knee, were thin and precise. Her eyes, when she turned them from the fire to the 2 people entering her room, were a clear, unsettling grey. Richard's eyes, or rather, he had inherited them from her, the chain going back in that direction. She looked at Vivian for a long moment before she looked at Richard, and the look was the kind that arrives before a greeting, complete and unhurried, taking the full measure of a person in one pass, without embarrassment or pretense. She said, "You look like her." Vivian said, "Like whom?" Augusta said, "Sit down." They sat. Vivian in the chair the manservant drew up across from the fire, Richard standing for a moment, and then settling on the edge of the low sofa, as though he did not quite trust himself to be comfortable. His grandmother watched this without comment, which was its own commentary. Richard said, "We have come because we believe you may know something about the beginning of the boundary dispute, about what actually happened between the families, before the legal proceedings." Augusta was quiet. She looked at the fire for a few seconds. She said, "I know you have come because something has frightened you, both of you, and you want to know whether you have been wrong about everything." She paused. She said, "You have been wrong about everything, but not in the way you think." She began at the beginning, which was further back than either of them had positioned it. The year was 1764, she said, and the Norbrook heir was her husband's brother. His name was Edmund, 22 years old, a fair-haired young man who had been betrothed to a Netmont daughter since the previous autumn, at a time when both families were on terms of easy friendship, when the lower meadow was the natural path between the two houses, rather than the line of a dispute, and when the boundary stone had just been cut and set, the letters N and P facing each other as a marker for the wedding. A gesture of the two families joining rather than a record of their separation. The wedding was set for the 20th of April. On the 1st of April, 19 days before, Edmund's horse came back without him. Augusta said this plainly. She was 91, and she had been carrying the weight of it for 60 years, and she had reached, somewhere in that time, the stage of grief that sits past its own intensity and becomes simply a fact among other facts. Still present, still weighty, but no longer sharp. She said, "He rode out after rain. The path by the upper field was soft. Nobody saw it happen. The horse came back at dusk. They found Edmund at the foot of the rise below the oak that still stands at the corner of the upper pasture. He had been dead for several hours. Vivian did not move. Richard, on the edge of the sofa, had his hands clasped on his knees and his head down at a slight angle, not looking away but looking inward, and the line of his jaw was very still. Augusta said, "What happened after was not a decision that anyone made. It was something that happened to two families that were in too much pain to do anything but hurt each other. The Netmont daughter," she said her name, the other Vivian, your great-aunt's sister, had loved Edmund since they were children. She did not come out of her room for a month after he died. Her father, trying to protect her from the pity of the county, trying to give her some dignity in the ruin of what had been arranged, told people that the match had been broken off, that Norbrook had reconsidered. A lie, said Augusta, told by a man at the limits of his capacity to bear the thing as it was. The Norbrook side, her husband's family, grieving their own, heard the story and reacted to it in the way of people who have been told that their grief has been publicly reframed as a slight. They said the Netmonts had driven Edmund away, that the betrothal had been impossible, that the girl's temperament had made the heir despair of the match. Another lie, said Augusta, told by different people at the limits of a different grief. She looked at Vivian and she said, "And the meadow." The lower meadow that sat between the two estates, that Edmund used to ride across every week to call at Whitecroft. No one knew quite what to do with it after he was gone. The Norbrook solicitor, not the one you've met, his grandfather, a man who confused legal principle with moral resolution, drew a boundary where there had been none, staking a claim to the meadow because claiming something solid was easier than sitting with what had been lost. And the Netmonts contested it for the same reason. She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. From somewhere in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. She said, "The stone was cut for a wedding. It stood there for 60 years, between two families conducting a suit that was, at its root, the legal form of their refusal to say that Edmund died, and both of them were left. There was never a theft. There was never a jilting. There was a fair-haired young man on a soft path after rain, and then there was not. The three of them sat with it. What is remarkable, in retrospect, and this is the kind of remark a narrator can only make with the advantage of knowing what follows, is not that the revelation broke something, but that it resolved something that had been under pressure for so long that neither party could accurately remember a time before the pressure. Vivian had walked into Whitecroft's study in March and seen her father's annotations on a map, had counted the cost of a 60-year argument in mortgages and failed harvests and one farm near surrender. She had known the weight of the dispute in every material sense. What she had not known was that on the other side of the boundary stone, in a house that had seemed impervious to anything so ordinary as loss, Someone had been carrying an equal weight for the same number of years. She looked at Richard. He had raised his head from its inward angle, and he was looking at Augusta, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the careful composition, not the controlled attention, but something older and less managed. The face of someone sitting with a grief that turns out to be inherited, that arrived with the house and the title and the dark coat, and had been his without his knowledge for 34 years. Augusta watched him with the clear grey eyes. She said to him specifically, "You are not your grandfather's solicitor. You were never required to maintain this." He said, after a pause, "I didn't know what I was maintaining." Augusta said, "No one does with the old ones. That's rather the point." She reached forward then, with the precise hands, and lifted the small glass vase from the mantelpiece. She held it in both palms, the dried white flowers, the parchment petals, the black stems, and she set it on the table between herself and Vivian. She said, "Those are from the Whitecroft garden. Edmund brought them the last time he called." She was quiet. She said, "I kept them because throwing them away seemed like agreeing that he hadn't existed." Vivian looked at the vase for a long moment. The glass was clean. Whatever else 60 years had accumulated in this room, someone had kept the glass clean, and the smallness of that attention was more precise than any of the legal documents in the cold-panelled chamber at Chancery. More precise than the folios and the survey figures and the fraudulent survey that Mr. Croft had helped them identify, which was not a fraud at all, but simply a boundary drawn in grief, by a man with a pen and no better instrument available. She said, "What was she like, the other Vivian?" Augusta looked at her for a moment. She said, "Capable, decided, not particularly interested in what people thought of her. She managed her father's estate from the age of 23 when he became ill." She said it without emphasis, which was the heaviest possible emphasis. Vivian said nothing. Richard, from the sofa, also said nothing, but she was aware of the quality of his silence, which was the same awareness she had carried since August and the harvested field. The peripheral precision that was no longer entirely peripheral. They left Augusta's house in the early afternoon. The October light had thinned by then, and the crescent was quiet. A few dead leaves moving in a cold current along the pavement. Vivian came down the steps first, and stood on the pavement while Richard spoke a last word to the manservant at the door. She was looking at nothing in particular, at the grey sky above the roofline, where a pair of starlings were conducting a short, efficient argument before separating in different directions. Richard came down the steps and stood beside her. They stood there for a moment without speaking, and the silence had none of the strain that silences in exposed places carry, when two people have just received the kind of information that reorganises the ground underfoot. It was the silence of people who have had the same conversation without words, and know that the words, when they come, will not need to carry the full weight. Only the particular thing that words are for, which is making the understood explicit. He said, "Mr. Fra, what he told you." She said, "I don't think he knew it was wrong. I think he found the Netmon family account and took it at face value." Richard said, "That's a charitable reading of a man who let you believe the worst of this family for 6 months." She said, "It may be." She paused. She said, "Or he is a man who found a story that made the situation comprehensible and stopped there, because the comprehensible story was sufficient for his purposes. That is not precisely the same as malice." Richard was quiet for a moment, He said, "You are more generous to him than I am." She said, "I have found, generally, that most people who cause harm are working from incomplete information rather than bad intention. This is not the same as forgiving them. It simply makes them less interesting as enemies." He made a short, quiet sound that she identified, after a second, as a laugh. Small, involuntary, the kind that escapes before the man producing it has made a decision about whether to produce it. It was the first time she had heard it, and it surprised her. And the surprise of it stayed with her as they walked to where the carriage was waiting at the crescent's end. The leaves moving cold around their feet. Richard's dark coat close against the grey afternoon. The sound of London going on around them in its indifferent, thorough way. The papers from Chancery were still in the folio case inside the carriage. The documents that needed to be signed. The formal end of the suit. They both knew this, and neither mentioned it. Because what had changed in Augusta's front room was not the legal position. The paperwork would be the same paperwork it had been this morning. But the thing the paperwork would now mean when it was signed, which was different from what it would have meant before. She did not yet know what he intended to do with that difference. She knew what she would do. She had known it since the moment Augusta set the small vase on the table between them, and she looked at the dried white flowers and understood what had been sitting at the bottom of 60 years of argument. Not a theft, not a lie told with malice, but two sets of people reaching for something solid, when the solid thing they actually had was too fragile and too final to hold directly. But whether Richard had arrived at the same place, whether what she had seen in his face in that room, that unmanaged expression that she had no name for, would translate into the specific action she had been turning over since Augusta's door closed behind them, that she did not know yet. And the not knowing had a particular quality. It was not the anxious not knowing of a thing that might go wrong, but the open not knowing of a thing still becoming. And these are not the same condition at all. The carriage moved. Outside, London went grey in the early dark. The folio case sat on the seat between them. The Chancery papers were signed in London before they left. The formal withdrawal of the suit on both sides. Both names in the register. Mr. Croft witnessing with the particular attention of a young man who understands he is present at an ending that has been a long time arriving and is determined to give it the clerical precision it deserves. That was one document. The second document was not a Chancery document. It was prepared by Greaves alone and signed by Richard in the estate office on a grey November morning, 3 days after their return to Ravenlay, while Vivian was riding the southern field boundary with Mr. Fenn to assess the drainage work before the hard frosts came in. She came through the side door at midday with mud on her boots and cold in her coat, and found Greaves already gone and the document set square on the centre of her desk, weighted at its corner by the small, empty violet vase, which had been sitting there since October, when the last of the dried flowers finally gave up their stems. It was a deed of transfer, written on good parchment in Greaves's careful hand. The lower meadow, the flood meadow, the osiers and the lapwings and the limestone marker, all of it, conveyed to Vivian Netmont Norn, Duchess of Norbrook, in her own name, in perpetuity, with no conditions and no exchange of consideration noted. Her name in Richard's handwriting in the space Greaves had left blank at the top of the document. Written in the same small, controlled script as the note he had sent in April confirming the meeting at Aldwick. The one that had come after the initial letter. The one that had put his given name first. She stood at the desk with her glove still in her hand. She read it through twice without sitting down. Then she opened the left drawer and folded it along its crease, and laid it inside. Beside the cornelian seal ring on its ribbon, which had been resting there since September. She went to find him. He was in the library, the fire well up, a ledger open on the table at his elbow that was clearly not what he had been attending to before she came in. She opened the door without knocking, a habit that had arrived quietly somewhere around October and had not been rescinded. And she stood in the doorway with the corridor light behind her. She said, "You didn't ask me first." He said, "No." She said, "The meadow is mine." He said, "Yes." She considered him for a moment across the room. The controlled composition, the hands flat on the table, the ledger as alibi. She had enough evidence now to read what the composition was holding. The way she read the barometer and the western sky. And what she read was a man waiting to see whether the thing he had done was sufficient, or whether it had been wrong in some way he had not calculated for. She said, "Thank you." He said, looking at the ledger, "You're welcome." She pulled the door closed behind her, which was also a new habit, closing it gently rather than leaving it open, as though the room was worth preserving. Lady Bellingham had been busy in the weeks since London. Vivian learned the shape of it from Mrs. Halsworth, the wife of the mill owner from the Eastern Valley, who arrived at Ravenlay one afternoon in late November with the specific purpose of being the person who delivered the information rather than the person who didn't, and who told it with the compressed precision of a woman who considers a useful truth to be worth more than a comfortable silence. The rumour, as Lady Bellingham had refined and circulated it at 2 separate gatherings since October, was this: that the Duchess of Norbrook had brought a claim of poverty to the boundary negotiations, knowing it to be false, that the Duke had been manoeuvred into the marriage, and that the subsequent withdrawal of the suit represented not a settlement between 2 families, but a capitulation by one. The story was effective because it was structural. It did not require Lady Bellingham to be believed about specific facts, only about the general shape of a scheme, which is always harder to refute than a single claim. Vivian received it from Mrs. Halsworth with the attention it deserved, asked 3 clarifying questions, thanked her, and put it in the category of problems that would resolve themselves if given the correct occasion. The occasion was the Hinton Winter Assembly, held in the 2nd week of December at the Assembly Rooms above the Coaching Inn, a low-ceilinged room with 6 chandeliers and a floor that had hosted 60 years of county gatherings, its boards worn to a pale smoothness in the centre from decades of dancing, and to a darker colour at the edges where people had stood to watch. For the occasion, Vivian had accepted from Mrs. Harker a string of garnets that had lived in the Norbrook jewel case without a wearer for 11 years. A collar of small dark stones in gold settings, the colour of old wine, which Mrs. Harker had laid out on the dressing table without remark, as she had learned to do with all suggestions she judged necessary and preferred not to debate. The garnets sat at Vivian's throat all evening with the cool weight of something that had waited a long time to be worn. The room was full. The county had come, as the county always came to the Winter Assembly. The Halsworths, the Pembers' eldest son with his wife, Mr. Ashworth from Hinton Church with his quiet new wife, a dozen families from the Valley Farms, 3 sets of Norbrook tenants including Alderton and Cray side by side near the punch table, which was a small miracle of geography attributable to the drainage ditch and the mason's 2-day repair. Lady Bellingham was near the west wall in a gown of deep burgundy that required no garnets and was designed to be noticed from across the room. Richard was beside Vivian, dark coat, no ornamentation, watching the room with his usual calibrated attention. The dancing had been going for an hour when Vivian stepped away from it. She went to the centre of the floor and she waited until the music concluded, and then she spoke, clearly and without preamble, into the brief quiet between one movement and the next. She said, she wished to address the families assembled, because a story had been circulating about the settlement between Norbrook and Whitecroft, and the true account differed from it in ways that mattered. She told it in the precise, unhurried manner she had developed for addressing tenant meetings and estate accounts, the manner that communicated respect for the listener's intelligence, and impatience for anything that wasted their time. She told the story Augusta had given them. Edmund Norn, the fair-haired heir, the path soft after rain, the horse returning without its rider. The grief of two families inventing lies to bear an unbearable thing. The solicitor drawing a boundary where none had been, and the boundary becoming a suit, and the suit consuming 60 years because it was easier to argue than to remember. The boundary stone cut for a wedding, not a theft. She named no one for fault. She assigned no blame to the dead, who had been frightened and grieving, and had done what frightened, grieving people do. She said, there was never a villain. There was only a great deal of shared pain, and a 60-year failure to say so aloud. The room held the silence that rooms hold when a truth has been given to them that they did not expect, and are now deciding whether to receive. Then Mr. Alderton, near the punch table, clapped once, a single sound, deliberate, not a performance, but an acknowledgement, and the room followed. Lady Bellingham waited until the applause had nearly subsided. Then she said, in the carrying register of a woman who has practiced her timing, "How commendable in a duchess so eager to clear her husband's name. One does wonder what she is preserving in her own." The room went quiet again, but differently. The quality of quiet that falls when everyone in a space has reached the same conclusion at the same moment and is choosing how to express it. Mrs. Halsworth turned her back. Alderton and Cray did the same, and the gesture rippled outward through the room in the way that social judgments spread in closed communities. Rapidly, completely, and without appeal. Lady Bellingham found herself in an expanding vacancy. Not a confrontation, nothing so satisfying as open argument. Simply the steady movement of the room away from her, the dancers resuming their figure, the musicians striking up, the conversations closing around her like water filling a space. She left before the second dance finished. Vivian watched her go and then turned back to the room, and Richard was beside her. Close enough that the sleeve of his dark coat was against her arm, and he did not look at the door Lady Bellingham had closed behind her, or at the room rearranging itself in the aftermath of a social verdict. He looked at Vivian. She became aware of the garnets at her throat, the cool gold of the settings, the weight of 11 years of waiting to be worn. They rode home under the moon. It was full and very bright for December, the kind of winter moon that casts shadows in the manner of low sun, long and sharp and clear, and the road home from Hinton ran between bare hedgerows that threw their own shadows across the pale ruts of the lane. Their horses moved at an easy walk, because neither of them had proposed going faster, and the night was cold and entirely still, and the cold was the clean kind rather than the damp kind, the kind that makes the air feel more itself. They had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes without speaking. This was not uncommon. They had developed a vocabulary of silences in the months since the wedding, and this particular one had the texture of something being held and considered before it was said. Vivian was aware of this in herself. She was also aware, with the peripheral precision that had been sharpening for months and was now simply a fact of how she understood the space between them, that he was doing the same thing. She said, "Richard." The word sat in the cold air with a clarity that the formal title had never had. 2 syllables, his name, the one that had come first in April's note, and that she had not used aloud in 8 months of marriage. She had not planned the moment. It had arrived in the way that certain necessary things arrive. Not when prepared for, but when the distance between the current state of things and the true state of things becomes too wide to maintain. He stopped his horse. She stopped hers. She said, "I love you." That was all. No architecture, no qualification, no careful construction. The words in their plainest form, given across the 4 feet of moonlit lane, between 2 horses standing still. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it she had not heard before. A fracture in the careful composition. The sound of a structure that has been held closed for a long time and is opening along a seam it chose rather than one forced on it. He said, "Will you say my name again?" She said, "Richard." He said, "Yes." The horses stood. Their breath rose in small clouds in the December air and dissolved. The bare hedgerow threw its long moon shadow across the lane. Neither of them moved for a moment, and the moment had the quality of a thing that is being learned rather than experienced. Taken in with the attention that Vivian gave to everything she meant to understand completely. The barometer, the drainage ditch, the flicker in a man's eye, the weight of a ring placed in a warm hand at an altar in spring. 3 summers later, on an evening in June when the light went long and gold across the water meadow and the osiers had leafed to their fullest green, the Duke and Duchess walked out to the boundary stone. They brought their daughter, who was 2 years old and was called Edmund's name in its feminine form, Edwina, called Edie by everyone including her father, which had surprised Vivian and then had not. Edie walked the path in short, determined bursts, stopping to examine things, a beetle, a tuft of rush grass, a pebble of white quartz, with the total absorption that belongs to people for whom the world is still entirely new and therefore entirely interesting. The evening smelled of cut hay from the far field, and river water and the particular sweetness of warm stone. At the boundary, Edie stopped. She put her small hand against the limestone and looked at the 2 letters, the N and the P, cut 60 years ago, worn now at their edges to a softness that made them look almost gentle. And she traced them with her finger, the slow, concentrated attention of someone practicing an alphabet. She looked up at Vivian and said, "What's that?" Vivian crouched beside her in the long grass. She looked at the letters and at the child's finger resting between them. She said, "They mean a wedding that took a very long time to happen." Edie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all information. She said, "Why?" Richard crouched on the other side of her, dark coat, the late light catching the silver at his temples that had not been there in April 3 years ago. He looked at Vivian across the top of their daughter's head. His face held the thing she had stopped trying to name, the thing that had no name in the vocabulary she had used before she came to this house, that she had learned instead the way she had learned everything else here, through patient watching over sufficient time. He said to Edie, "That is a very long story." Edie looked at the letters again. She put both hands flat on the stone, the small palms warm against the limestone. The river ran beside them, slow and full with summer, and the grass came thick and green to the stone's base, and the light went on across the meadow with no boundary in it at all.